Have you ever wondered why Pokemon, what Pokemon, or maybe even wonder what Far Art Thou Pokemon game should I play first? Well, I haven't because I have been a fan for life until very recently. And when I started thinking more about it, it definitely became a more intriguing discussion with the voices in my head. And in the comments of some of my videos, I've seen a lot of newer fans talking about their experiences with these games. And being someone who has played every single one of these games, I wanted to throw out my opinion as a lifelong fan of the series. Now, this will only be the mainline games, so I won't be talking about any of the spin-offs. And if you wanted to play a spin-off, you probably already know what freakish game you wanted to play. Go play Pokemon Ranger and destroy your DS. And I also like making these videos because sometimes it just makes me feel happy to help some people into getting into a new franchise, especially one that I love. So whether you're a new fan looking for answers, well, welcome and hope you do. Or whether you're an older fan, I think this will be an interesting discussion to have in the comments below. But this is only my opinion, as I'm sure a lot of other people will have issues with the way I approach this. But I'd urge you to hopefully read the comments before you make your final decision. Or if you have any other comments that you'd like to make on what I say here, leave them down below as well, because I think this is really just a jumping off point to have this discussion on what should a newer Pokemon fan actually start off with. Now, with that being said, the first question you really have to ask yourself is, are you actually willing to emulate Pokemon games? Because if you're not, then this is actually going to get a little bit easier than you might think, because I can't really take you seriously. I'm just kidding. But if you're not willing to emulate, then that means it's going to really limit your choices unless you also have an unlimited wallet glitch. These games are quite expensive if you don't know. So if you don't want to emulate these games, then I highly suggest that you just play the game that you might already have, or just play a game that you have the easiest access to. If you have a Switch, just maybe try out Pokemon Sword and Shield or Scarlet and Violet. I'm sure you can find them used somewhere for a pretty decent price, and it's probably the cheapest way to play a new Pokemon game. The other thing you need to know is most Pokemon games aren't really connected. A lot of them are just these individual experiences that you can play at any point in the series. There's no real reason to play one before another, except for a very few certain ones. Now, if you do want to emulate them, or you do have the infinite money glitch, please share your credit card details down below. But we can finally actually get started on the real discussion on which Pokemon game you should play first. But I'm actually going to start with which Pokemon games I think you should avoid first. First games that I really think that you should avoid, and it's not because they're bad, it's just because they're kind of old, is Red, Blue, Green, Yellow, Gold, and Silver, and Crystal. These Game Boy games are just kind of old, and honestly, there's not really much of a reason to play them because they have other versions of these games that are frankly better to play, especially as a first-timer. I only go back to these as a old-time fan, and that's why I play them. And honestly, the same thing can go for games like Ruby and Sapphire, Diamond and Pearl, because those games are, while I really do love these games personally, they're not really the best to play for a new starter, as there is a better version to play that we'll discuss a little bit later on. Then we also have to get into the discussion about the kind of pseudo-sequel games. I mean, this is a direct sequel. So Pokemon Black and White 2, this is a direct sequel to Pokemon Black and White, and it doesn't really make sense to start off with this game if you haven't played Pokemon Black and White. If you're gonna play more than one game, it definitely makes sense to start with Pokemon Black and White and then go into this one. And kind of the same thing with Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon. It's not as direct a sequel as Sun and Moon, but it's kind of an ultimate version of this game in a weird, almost alternate universe, but I would just highly recommend you probably start with Sun and Moon before. Now, if you are pretty serious about this, I think one of the best places to start is actually with some of the Game Boy games, and the first being Pokemon Leaf Green, or Pokemon Emerald if you will go like that. But Pokemon Leaf Green is actually a pretty easy game to start off with. One, because it's one of the earlier Game Boy Advance games and it's relatively easy to get into, and there isn't too many extra mechanics to get into, especially if you're a younger person and you're going to just emulate it anyways. But also because it is a Gen 1 remake and the best Generation 1 remake that we have. Pokemon Leaf Green also has just a great tutorial section for just learning a lot about the mechanics of the game, and it's also a pretty easy tutorial sequence to get into. But it's also a tutorial section that doesn't really get too in the way of a lot of these other games. A lot of these other games, the tutorial sequences really bog down the early game experience, and just definitely make it a lot of slog. Even for a new player, I think they'll be quite annoyed at some of these games, especially games like Pokemon Sun and Moon. Now, other games that you might have heard of that you think you should play first, and I would also recommend, especially if you want to play one of the best games, is a game like Emerald, Platinum, Heart Gold, Soul Silver. Those games like those are highly regarded as some of the best Pokemon games in the entire franchise. Games like Heart Gold and Soul Silver just have so much extra content that is not in other games, and also has fun mechanics like Pokemon that follow behind you for most of the entire game. And that's just a lot of fun and makes the experience a little bit more personable with your Pokemon. Especially for games like Pokemon Emerald and Pokemon Platinum, there's so much extra content that are added to the games that just make them better experiences than the original Ruby and Sapphire or Diamond and Pearl. So it makes them, especially if you're only going to play one of them, you should probably just start with one of those, because they're often revised stories, revised content, and they overall just make the game better in every way in general. Now, there are a few games that are still on this list that I haven't talked about, and there's one special choice on this list that I think is specifically for people who want a Pokemon game with a good story, and I just did an entire retrospective on these games, and that is Pokemon Black and White, the Generation 5 games. I highly recommend you actually start with these games. One of the most controversial things is that they don't have a lot of the older Pokemon in them, but if you are just starting out with the series, that's not really going to be much of a problem for you. And also, these games have some of the best storylines in the entire series, so I highly recommend you actually play these games pretty early on, if not your very first Pokemon game. They're also just high quality games in general, and they don't add too much extra shit, honestly, in the games like Mega Evolutions or Z-Moves and stuff that were very only one generation specific for that generation. And Pokemon Black and White is a very vanilla-ish Pokemon game experience, but it has a great story, great characters, and it's just definitely one of my favorite and often regarded as one of the best Pokemon games in general. There are some games though that I would say you could probably start off with. A game like Pokemon X and Y, or even a game like Pokemon Sun and Moon, the original Sun and Moon. But personally, while these games are good, and I think you could definitely start up, there's nothing that's going to stop you, and if you have easy access to this game, then I do highly recommend. Pokemon Sun and Moon has some great characters, and Pokemon X and Y is, well, I like Mega Evolutions, and it introduced that mechanic in the game, but I wouldn't, these are probably lower on the list of games that you could play first, but I also don't think they're bad choices. And if these are also some of the cheaper ones, I think, personally. If you do have a 3DS already and you haven't played them, these are some of the easiest games to just get right into and get relatively cheap currently. I think prices are only going to get more and more expensive for these games, though. I think it's also time to discuss quickly a game like Pokemon Let's Go Eevee. I think, again, this is also a really good game to start, especially if you are younger, but I don't really know if it's worth it unless you just really like the Pokemon following behind you mechanic from something like Heart Gold, Soul Silver, but you want some more modern graphics. But this is definitely a game that's a lot more different than a lot of the other Pokemon games out there. And I don't know if I really recommend it as a first place to start if you want to play a true blue Pokemon game. And that's kind of almost the same with a game like Pokemon Legends Arceus, which is one of my favorite games and one of the games that really got me back into playing Pokemon a lot again. If you're more into action games and you want to play something like this, then I highly recommend you start playing it if you are into action games. But if you're not, and you really want, again, a true blue Pokemon experience, then you actually are probably better off to start off with a game like Pokemon Sword and Shield or even Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, which these aren't exactly my favorite games in the entire series, but you have easy access to them. They're pretty good, decent places to start. Now, there's another bonus question that you might be wondering, what is the best place to start actually playing these, assuming you don't have any consoles at all? Now, I mean, you could start with a Game Boy, but that's only going to get you a couple games. You can start with a Game Boy Advance, but again, that's only going to get you Game Boy and Game Boy Advance games. A DS is going to get you a couple more, but it's not going to get you Game Boy games. You could also go with a Nintendo Switch, but unless you're going to hack it, then you can't play most of the games. You can really only play the Switch games. So that's why I think, especially if you are not adverse to hacking, I actually highly recommend that you get yourself a 3DS if you want to play the maximum amount of Pokemon games in general. At this point, we've already kind of acknowledged that you're around for some degeneracy, so if you're really into that, I highly recommend getting a 3DS and modding it. And you can play pretty much almost every single game besides for the Switch games with this. With the 3DS, at least natively, you can play all of the 3DS games, which is a ton of games. You can also play all of the DS games natively. And with a little tweaks and twerks, you can actually play all of the Game Boy Advance games with the VG injection, which is something that you'll have to just go look up for yourself. You can also get the Game Boy and Game Boy Color games, all those games on here as well. And You used to be able to just buy them from the store. Now you'll have to find them by other means if you haven't already downloaded them. But this means you can play every single mainline Pokemon series game except for the Switch games. And then if you buy a 3DS and a Switch, you can play literally every single game pretty easily, and you can also play them in a 2-screen format, which is highly recommended if you want to play the DS and 3DS games for the very first time, that you actually play them on a DS or 3DS if you can get one. I mean, you can emulate them, of course, but I think for your first time, it's a much more fun experience if you can actually play them with 2 screens. But if you wanted one overall recommendation, I guess, from me for which Pokemon game you should play first, honestly, I would highly recommend that you just start off with a game like Heart Gold and Soul Silver. It's a pretty basic game. It's one of the best games in general. It also has some of the most content in the game. You will be playing this game forever if you start off playing this. There's some little bit of sections of the game that can get a little bit grindy, but I think if you're in for the experience to just kind of relax and play a Pokemon game, especially over the summer or something, I think you can't go wrong with a game like Heart Gold and Soul Silver because it's a beautiful game, a lot of extra content. It has 2 whole regions to explore in the game. It has tons of Pokemon from across all first 4 generations. So yeah, I would highly recommend you actually just start off with this game if you want just one recommendation from me personally. I did collect some hard facts and data on the fan base from my users or subscribers. That makes me sound like druggies or something. A lot of you would also agree with Fire Red, Leaf Green, and Heart Gold and Soul Silver as two of the best options to actually start off with. Otherwise, you also did seem to agree that Black and White might also be a pretty good start with some of the comments, but overall, I think we're all in agreement mostly on that these are probably some of the best places to start. But again, if you have your own opinion, either go to the poll or go in the comments below if you don't want to give me engagement for this video. The popularity of this poll already kind of scares me a little bit. This is probably the most responsive I've gotten on any of my polls ever. But with all that being said, I hope you enjoyed this. And again, if you have another opinion, then leave it down below. This is, again, just to start off a discussion on what even should a new Pokemon fan even start off with. I'm not 100% sure if this is even the right answer, but this is just my opinion on what I think someone should start off with. And if you do end up starting off with one of these games, come back and let me know if you actually like the series or not. And if you're just going to stay on the bandwagon of all the other people that just seem to hate Pokemon nowadays. Anyways, hope you have a good one and see you next time.